So now we're at 10, and I'm excited to introduce our keynote speaker today. So Dr. Paul Gorski is the founder of the Equity Literacy Institute and EdChange. He has more than 20 years of experience helping educators, nonprofit workers, and others to strengthen their equity efforts. He has worked with educators in 48 states and a dozen countries. Paul has published more than 70 articles and has co-written, or co-edited 12 books on various aspects of educational equity, including reaching and teaching students in poverty, strategies for erasing the opportunity gap, and case studies on diversity and social justice education. He's also the author of the Multicultural Pavilion, an online compendium of free resources for educators. Paul earned a PhD in educational evaluation at the University of Virginia. He was a teacher educator at several universities for 15 years. He is also a published poet, a black belt in taekwondo, and the biggest fan of Buster, his cat. We are cat lovers in this room, so we're excited. And we are so excited to have you here today, Dr. Gorski. So I'll pass the mic to you.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And hi, everybody. It's good to see you all from the other coast. I guess I should add to that list that I'm also a new father. I need to change whatever bio you're reading there. I feel awful. I left my this little cutie off of the list.
Oh my gosh, beautiful. Buster has been moved aside now.
He's only been moved aside a little. So yeah, so that's Maddie, my daughter, Maddie. So and thank you for all the congrats. Okay, so all right, refocus. And I'm a little distracted too, because she and my partner are in Chicago at a conference for a few days, and I'm like desperately missing my baby. So if you just see me disappear, I'm on a plane to Chicago in the middle of the workshop. So anyway, okay, I need to get focused here. Let's do a screen share. And, I've been trying really hard to unhook from PowerPoint. I just feel like I need some sort of, I don't know, I need to be deprogrammed or something when it comes to PowerPoint, but I can't, I'm just not quite there yet. So here's my PowerPoint. And I'm also excited because, even us equity and justice people love our little tools. And I recently got this new version of PowerPoint that automatically does the subtitling. So the closed captioning, I should say. So I'm excited to use that. It's like my new toy. So, okay. So what I was asked to speak with you all about today is embracing and enacting a transformative vision for anti-racism, a transformative vision for anti-racism. My experience over the past 20, 25 years, working with all different kinds of educational institutions, from higher ed to preschools to K-12 to nonprofit organizations to activist organizations. My experience when it comes to anti-racism is the problem is generally not a scarcity of people who see themselves as committed to anti-racism, and generally the issue is not a lack of programs and neat student opportunities and that sort of thing. Often instead, the challenge is about the depth and the transformative potential of an understanding for what anti-racism is and the vision for anti-racism, and then the consistent application of that vision. Now, I'm especially excited today. I was going to say this afternoon, but for you it's morning, so I'll say this morning, I'm particularly excited because you all work in an institution with a reputation for institutional commitment to anti-racism, along with other justice issues. But even in those organizations and organizations like yours, there are particular ways in which racism, other kinds of equity issues are perpetuated, despite the sort of official curriculum or the official culture of anti-racism. So in the spirit of starting with the assumption that that you're starting with some level of commitment here. You're starting with some level of commitment. I'm going to start with that assumption, both because that's the reputation of your institution, but also because you're choosing to be in this session. So in the spirit of that, in the spirit of camaraderie, in the spirit of love among people who share this set of commitments, what I see my role as is, how can I challenge you to ensure that the vision you're embracing and enacting has the highest level of transformative potential possible? That's sort of what I see. That's how I see my role in the bigger conversation about matters of equity and justice and anti-oppression and those sorts of things. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And then we're following this up, I think I can't remember if it's a week or a couple weeks or a few weeks, with more of a sort of a workshop-y kind of situation, which will be a little bit more interactive and where we'll be able to apply some more of the ideas that that I'll be sharing with you today and engaging you with today. I want to start with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. This, by the way, if you haven't read The Letter from Birmingham Jail, you're cheating yourself, because it's such an amazing piece of literature. Not only is it one of the most important things ever written about anti-racism, but it's also one of the most beautifully written things about anti-racism. So just to set the scene, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is literally sitting in Birmingham jail, and he's frustrated as all heck. And, his frustration is not with the predictable racists, the Ku Klux Klan or, that sort of thing. In this context, he's frustrated with people who are espousing or claiming a commitment to anti-racism, philosophical commitment to civil rights, or whatever it is, but who in practice are not really walking the talk. And who he's specifically calling out is who he calls white moderates. Today, I think there are people, today the term white liberal is often used to sort of describe what he's talking about here. But what he says is, I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the stumbling block is not the white Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice. And then this is the piece that pops out at me in a conversation like this. He says, so the stumbling block is the white moderate who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. And I just want to pause on that for a second, because in my own work and other people's work, looking at this notion of quote unquote white liberalism, and we're actually going to talk about that a little bit later, that this is sort of one of the characteristics of it. Mistaking sort of conflict resolution as anti-racism, reflecting, mistaking sort of, can we all just dialogue and get along with one another as anti-racism. Without recognizing, of course, that the tension already exists. The tension is the racism. So the tension already exists. So part of the challenge, just to sort of lay out the baseline challenge here, is what version of this am I embracing? And we might ask that of ourselves as individuals. We might also ask that of our institution or organization. What version of this am I embracing? Am I embracing the negative peace version of it? Like, well, as long as on the surface it looks like everyone's getting along with each other, then we're okay. Or am I embracing the positive peace version of this? Which is not about, at the surface level, everyone seeming like, they're getting along with each other and there's a good community, but instead it's about identifying every way racism is operating and eliminating it. That's in the end what anti-racism work is, and the active cultivation of anti-racism. It's really interesting, this next part where he says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action. It's like nothing has changed, right? It's like, oh yeah, of course I don't want police officers murdering unarmed Black people in the streets, but please, I don't want you kneeling during, it's the same, it's the same thing where all of a sudden the conversation is about the protesters and how they're protesting rather than what the protesters are forced to protest, So, so here's just a sort of reflection question that I want to pose to you, and feel free to throw something in the chat box. But there at Seattle Central College, what is the negative piece? What are the things that are happening that might sort of create the illusion of anti-racism without actual anti-racism, or that might substitute kind of a softer and fluffier version of it than what we really need? You might ask this of the institution, what are the policies and the practices, and that might sort of reflect this negative piece rather than a positive piece. But you might also ask that, we all might also ask this of ourselves. What is the negative piece in my approach? What are the ways that I might be not quite walking my philosophical commitment, putting it into action? Yeah. Thank you, Cassandra, not sure how to pronounce that. Yeah, thank you. Aaron. Yeah. Yeah, anywhere where we see optics over the reality. And in education, I don't know enough about your institution in particular to say this about your college, but in education in general, there's this epidemic, and that's because people, especially people in leadership, are rewarded for the optics, but often punished for the real anti-racism work, So this is something that we have to keep in mind. So I'm setting this as a baseline. My approach to this is not to do anything fluffy. In fact, I had two mentors when I was entering this work who said to me, as somebody with a lot of privileged identities who wants to do this work, they said, we really think that you have potential to be an asset in this work, and that's why we're going to mentor you and take you under our wing. But they said the trade-off is that if we ever catch you turning this into some fluffy cultural competence, celebrating diversity sort of thing, and not naming the things that need to be named. We are going to call you out publicly. They sort of threatened me. But but the lesson was an important lesson. And this is where we're starting. We're starting at an acknowledgement that what we're after here is the positive piece, which is the presence of justice. And we all want that philosophically. So the question is, how do we get there? How do we make sure that our actions and our engagement align with that philosophical commitment? I mean, the reality is the philosophical commitment doesn't make a whit of difference. The question is about the actions. The question is about the actions and the consistency of the actions. So later in the letter from Birmingham jail, by the way, Martin Luther King Jr. goes on to say that shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. I think this is equally powerful. So the question is not just about the philosophy behind it. Sort of the first step in enacting that deep transformative vision is, the goodwill is sort of like the desire for justice. And that's really important, the philosophical desire. But the philosophical desire without the deep understanding is not going to help. That's why, there's a lot more like, international food fairs and institutions of higher ed than there are anti-racist initiatives. Because people think that somehow they're going to get to anti-racism through celebrating diversity. When really the reality is the inverse of that. There's no authentic celebrating diversity in the absence of anti-racism. Okay, so I feel like we've exploited the labors of Dr. King enough now. So let's move to the next thing here. So a few starting assumptions. I already started talking about this a little bit. Starting assumption number one, just so you know where I'm coming from, is all members of a learning community deserve access to equitable and just educational, vocational, and other sorts of access and opportunity. I don't know why I have opportunity there twice. Maybe that's just for emphasis. I could have just italicized, I guess. But we should not be able to predict levels of access and opportunity based on people's race or their gender identity or expression or their sexual orientation or their socioeconomic status or their, can we all agree at least on this starting assumption? That all members of a learning community ought to have equitable and just access. Can you just type yes or maybe a Y in the chat box if you can agree with this assumption? Yes, 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 yes. Okay. I'm glad we're all on the same page on this. Okay. So here's my second starting assumption. Due to things like bias and inequity and oppression, not all members of your learning community currently have equitable and access and opportunity. This is not unique to your college, your learning community. It's true of every college and every learning community. And this is just as important a starting assumption. Okay. So then the question is, what do we do about that? Third starting assumption, we can't control everything. You as an individual person with your individual role can't necessarily, eliminate racism in the housing market or in healthcare or in any of the other innumerable systems in which it's operating. And so, I think it's important to acknowledge that we can't control everything. We got to think about, okay, well, what is my sphere of influence here? we do have the power to decide not to recreate that racism within our own spheres of influence. We do have the power to say, I might not be able to eliminate that racism, but I can be responsive to that racism. I can construct policies and practices that's responsive to the impact of that racism, the impact that it has on my colleagues, on students, on staff, on whoever else it is. The fifth starting assumption is, I always feel naive with this starting assumption. But again, and the reality is, this is a naive assumption that we all have good intentions. I mean, in the end, if we all had good intentions, I think we'd be way further along in eliminating the inequity and the injustice. But just as a sort of a pedagogical practice, I'm going to start with the assumption that we, meaning the people who are engaging in this conversation right now, that we have good intentions. We want to eliminate racism, at least on some philosophical level. But my last starting assumption is good intentions really don't mean anything in the anti-racism work. What means something in anti-racism work, again, is good action, transformative action. So we have this, and we call it the equity literacy equation. It's about how do we strengthen our literacy around equity and justice and anti-racism and all kinds of anti-oppression. It starts with goodwill. It starts with that seed of the desire for justice. But then, as Martin Luther King Jr. taught us, it then requires also depth of knowledge. How does racism operate? How does anti-racism operate? How do we cultivate anti-racism instead of just being reactive to racism? That sort of depth of knowledge. What are we imagining racism is even? But then it also requires will, which is a commitment to action, not just belief. Like I know you just heard students sharing their experiences. And one thing that I see in a lot of institutions is this little sort of exploitive process where we'll hear the voices of students. And, that in and of itself is not the equity and justice work. The equity and justice work is, okay, now what are you going to do differently as an institution based on what the students had to say? What are you going to actually do? What are you going to transform? How are you going to transform policy? How are you going to transform practices? How are you going to reimagine institutional culture? So we need all of those things. We need all of those things. We need to challenge ourselves individually and institutionally to make sure that we have all of those things. I do see this question popping up. Do you think it's necessary to fully understand racism in order to embody anti-racism? I do actually, because anti-racism is the annihilation of racism. So I have to know what it is I'm annihilating, and I have to know what it is that I'm constructing. And again, the problem, working with institutions of higher ed, a lot of institutions of higher ed that are very well known for quote unquote social justice stuff are doing social justice, are mostly doing social justice stuff that has absolutely no chance of creating more social justice. A greater example of this is intergroup dialogue programs. There's nothing wrong with intergroup dialogue programs. They're individually beneficial, but there's no evidence that having an intergroup dialogue program at a college or a university makes that college or university less racist. There's zero evidence of that. And there's zero evidence that intergroup dialogue is a good solution to racism in general, unless I'm defining racism as individual people not being able to communicate and learn about, learn from each other's experiences. I think that's a very sort of vague and shallow understanding of what racism is. So my argument would be, and it's actually interesting, you're providing a great bridge here, because as you can see, we're actually going into this next. So thank you, Dr. Berry, for providing an unprompted bridge to our next section here. But yeah, I do think it's important. If we're going to annihilate something, then we need to understand it in order to annihilate it. You know, another example of this is a lot of higher ed institutions, their solution to racism is diversification. But that's, to me, that's backward thinking. To me, it's like the best, most sustainable way to diversify is to become anti-racist, rather than inviting people into the racism and then expecting them to fix the racism. You know, expect their mere presence to fix the racism. You know, that's based on, it's based either on a misunderstanding of what racism is, or it's based on, you know, a crafty approach at creating the illusion of wanting to fix a problem when we don't actually want to fix that problem. So you know, when I'm in a workshop and somebody says, okay, now we're going to define terms, I have to be honest with you. I often get sort of, it's like tedious. It's like, oh, I don't want to define terms. But I do think, just based on what we were just talking about there, that it might be useful just to think about, okay, well, what are some characteristics of a way we could think about racism that might deepen our anti-racism practice individually as well as institutionally? So there's a lot of different, you know, even people whose life work is built around anti-racism, of course, don't always agree on what the heck anti-racism is. But so I'm not going to make the argument here that I have the correct definition. What I am going to argue is I have a way of thinking about this, or I want to share with you a way of thinking about this, is a better way to put it. I'm going to share with you a way of thinking about this that I have found in my work with educational organizations has been particularly helpful in terms of maybe just shifting some of the angle of you know, how we look at this. So this comes from Dismantling Racism Works. It's, you know, it's not unique to them, and many of you probably are already embracing things like this. But when I got into this work in the 90s, the popular way of thinking about racism is this first bullet point. You know, it's really about naming social and institutional power, about naming power and injecting that. It wasn't new in the 90s. I mean, James Baldwin, I mean, all kinds of people had been talking about this, you know, forever. But in terms of sort of the popular conversation about it, at least in higher ed, was, okay, prejudice plus institutional power. I think with the sort of emergence of critical race theory, that this definition has maybe fallen a little out of favor, particularly because even though it names social and institutional power, it's still attached to an individual thing, which is racial prejudice. And really what critical race theory, among other things, was trying to inject was a more institutional, more structural view of racism. So I really like these two middle bullet points, thinking of a system of advantage based on race, or based on racism, or based on white supremacy, a system of oppression based on race. I think those two combined give us that, a white supremacy system. So a system of advantage based on race, system of oppression based on race. So what I find is that a big challenge for a lot of people is thinking about racism as incidents. Like this racist thing happened, or someone made a racist remark, or that sort of thing. And the problem with that is if that's what I'm fixated on, I'm actually missing most of the racism, which is actually operating all the time through institutions and systems and structures, through policy, through practice, through institutional culture. And if I really want to be able to be responsive to racism, or in other words, if I really want to be anti-racist, the first step is learning how to recognize how these, to recognize these systems of advantage and disadvantage, and how it's just operating all the time. I mean, that's another sort of tenet of critical race theory, which is it's not a series of incidents. It's something that is operating all the time. So I have to learn how to see how it's operating all the time, institutionally, systemically, structurally, right? Not just in terms of individual people's bias, although as we'll talk about here in a second, those are connected. So you might think of, and again, I'm not arguing this is the only way to think about this, but racism is a system of oppression and a system of advantage, or some people use the term privilege, based on race, the structural accumulative understanding of it, right? So it's the accumulative understanding. And in order to get this, I have to understand, particularly me as a white person, that I can be advantaged and participate in oppression, even if I don't believe some other group is inferior to mine. That's how a lot of people think of what racism is a belief system that white people are superior to some other group, you know, that sort of thing. You all are familiar with this, I'm sure, but, you know, an example of this would be, you know, there are these studies, really became popular maybe 10 or 12 years ago, where they looking at employment discrimination, employment racism. And what the researchers did is they would identify job openings, and they would send applications to the job openings, and they would send similar applications, but they would make the name different. For instance, they might give one applicant a stereotypically white sounding name. You know, I think Paul Gorski, that's pretty white sounding. And then they would give the other applicant a stereotypically black sounding name, or a name that might cue people to presume that the applicant is black. They would give them the same experience, same education level, same qualifications. They would make them equally good applicants, and all they would change is the name. And you all can guess what happened, right? The applicants with stereotypically black sounding names, for instance, were, depending on the study, 30 to 50% more likely to get a call back or whatever. Now, were the white people going in to apply for those jobs thinking as they were walking in, oh, I'm going to stick it to people of color today, I'm going to stick it to BIPOCs, you know, I'm going to go in here and use my whiteness? I mean, maybe some of them were, but most of them weren't thinking that the person looking at the applicants, you know, and this is part of white privileges. I don't have to spend a minute thinking about that because I'm advantaged for that. But the question is, it doesn't matter that I'm not walking into a job interview or applying for a job with the intention of participating in racism, because I reap the benefits of the racism, whether or not I'm actively participating in it. And that's still part of that system of advantage and disadvantage. So thinking about it that way just gives us a little bigger, a little deeper way of thinking about it than just thinking about individual attitudes and actions. So what this means is that, you know, that the anti-racism or any kind of equity and justice work, you know, anti-ableism, anti-sexism, anti-cisgenderism, whatever it is that it's not enough to just have an anti-bias approach. It's not enough just to shift people's attitudes. You know, there's a deeper thing that needs to be looked at here, and a deeper thing that needs to be addressed, right? And to me, that's the shift for a lot of institutions. That's the shift. The question is, do we have the ability and the humility to map out all the ways racism is operating, sexism, cisgenderism, ableism, xenophobia, whatever, heterosexism, whatever it is, name all the ways it's operating, the intentional, the unintentional, the big, the small, doesn't matter. It's about impact, not intention. So are we able to map out all the ways it exists, all the ways it operates? And then the question is, what are we doing about it? What are the systems of advantage? What are the systems of disadvantage? In other words, how is white supremacy sort of operating? Yeah, so let me, because this example of name bias is real and rampant, and just this example of employment discrimination is just one example of how that operates. You also see that happening in schools. You see that sort of bias operating in schools, another thing. Now, let me make a distinction here that it might be individual bias that on the sort of first level of contact with something like name bias has this kind of impact, but it's an institutional problem. It's a problem of institutional culture or institutional will that is allowed to happen. That is allowed to happen. You might even argue it's a problem of hiring. I mean, institutions committed to anti-racism hire people who are committed to anti-racism, right? So that needs to be addressed from the beginning, from the first contact. So this gets us to what we call my colleague Tahari Jackson developed this sort of framework where she talked about 3 layers of racism, and then we worked together to sort of build it out into what we call 6 layers. I don't have time to step through this too slowly, but the thing that I want to connect, because again, my experience working with institutions of higher ed, the important connection here is between the ideological racism of individuals and the institutional racism of institutions like colleges or universities or whatever else the institutions might be. But I just want to kind of quickly go through this to introduce the concepts, and we'll play with this a little bit more when I do the interactive workshop. So the first layer is called socio-historical racism. This is about how people are socialized to make meaning of race, ascriptions of inferiority and superiority, and how those are often so deeply embedded in people's psyches and so normalized that people just sort of see it as the truth. A lot of people, particularly white people, I think, have a hard time sort of critically analyzing it. And what's so difficult is the people who are the most grossly socialized also tend to be the people who would argue they're not socialized at all. And the difficulty with this is when I'm socialized into a particular view, it's hard for me to see that. I just think that's the normal way of thinking. I presume I sort of got to that on my own. So again, all of us, maybe around racism, maybe around cisgenderism, maybe around heterosexism or ableism, or, all of us probably could sort of look at this in ourselves. The second layer is called ideological racism. This is sort of the impact of that socio-historical training. So it's about people's worldviews, people's belief systems. And again, this is the impact of how people are socialized to see things and how they educate themselves and that sort of thing. So, but the other thing I want to mention about ideological racism is it also can be a choice. Sometimes people latch on to racist ideas or values regardless of whatever evidence they have that they're ridiculous values, just because, that's how their friends think, or that makes them feel more connected to their political ideology, or whatever. Part of the difficulty also of ideological racism is that there are pieces of it. You might think, okay, well, this is something that people who just have a certain political ideology have. But my experience, and I would guess some of the experience of you all, uh, again, I don't want to project this onto your institution, but my experience has been that oftentimes the hardest places to get a real sense of to get a real sort of sense of leverage or sense of a real sort of footing on anti-racism. Oftentimes, the most challenging places aren't the places where they're the most ideologically conservative people, but the places where they're the most liberal white people who sort of often are enacting racism in ways that might look to other liberal white people like as anti-racism. And again, that would be things like happy to participate in the dialogue, but when it comes to, transforming my curriculum, or when it comes to, rethinking my notions of fairness, there's this different kind of resistance there. And part of that is for people, and again, I would say, especially white people, whose identities are super invested in these notions of anti-racism, that there could be sort of a stuckness in that. There can be sort of a stuckness. There's a lot of great research, if you want to look into it, about what happens, for instance, when white feminist groups try to, embrace anti-racism and the sort of backlash that happens and that sort of thing, or other movements that are predominantly white, like environmental movement. Environmental justice as a movement was basically stolen from people of color and co-opted by white people. And a lot of parts of that movement just really refuse to address how racism is operating in that movement. And it's because a lot of the people in that movement are so invested in seeing themselves as progressive or whatever that, they won't entertain the possibility that racism exists, which in and of itself is a form of racism, So anyway, so ideological racism. The next layer is called individual racism. This is the result of ideological racism informing actions. So one person does a racist thing against another person. And of course, the key to understanding this is that this is not a question of intention, it's a question of impact. And this is sort of that, maybe a piece of that liberalism thing, which is, as I was critiquing myself for earlier, the presumption of good intentions. It's like, oh yeah, he says weird things sometimes, but he's really committed. He really loves his students, that sort of thing. If I want to see myself as anti-racist, even while I continue mindlessly perpetuating inequity or injustice, then what I want to be able to argue then is my intention isn't racist. Well, it doesn't matter whether my intention is racist. The question is whether my impact is racist. I'm sure you all have heard the whole intent impact thing. So, okay, now this is where the leap happens. This is where I think the important leap happens, which is, this is where we move from those individual things, individual attitudes, individual bias, individual actions, individual ideology, to institutional layers. So institutional racism is about how ideological racism is operationalized in an institution like a college. It can be enacted through policies, through practices. Sometimes there are policies that look equal on paper, but are inequitable in impact. Unspoken aspects of institutional culture that target or harm people of color, people of the global majority, BIPOCs, while advantaging white people. Institutional racism, which doesn't necessarily require a bunch of individual people committing individual racist acts. It only requires individual people to go along with institutional culture. I guess some people would call that a racist act, but it's, but because of that, it's a little bit more subtle, and it might be hard to recognize for people who aren't being plowed under by it. So part of what we have to do is learn how to see that operating.